Major General Deb, distinguished colleagues on the panel, and friends. It is always a privilege to be at such a distinguished gathering, and an even greater privilege in public life to actually arrive before you're expected. Many, unfortunately, the reputations of those in public life is for coming late rather than early. On the other hand, I'm putting in the caveat at the very beginning, I have to leave early, and I apologize for that. But you don't want to know the schedules that we are forced to keep. Whenever we address any particular theme, I always find it useful to begin by trying to understand precisely what we mean by every word that we use. The regional perspective, strategy, these are words that I think we don't need to argue about. We have a common understanding for them. But for me, the key word for this conference is, what do we precisely mean by Asia? Is Asia a legitimate word in the geostrategic context? As all of you surely know, Asia is a word invented by Europe, by the Greeks actually, and literally who kept on creating geography for the word as they moved eastwards from the Levant. So Asia became the Levant, and then it became Persia, and then eventually when a Macedonian found his way to the Indus, it acquired the geography of certain parts of India. At that time, they believed that the end of the world was actually on the shores of India. So the whole of China didn't exist in this Asia. But to come down from those to the story of 2400 years later, you will recall, all of you in this room, that one of the first phrases that defined the post-colonial period of our history, a very important period of our history, because we were beginning to examine the world from our perspectives, not from the perspectives of those who had conquered us or colonized us or ruled us. And when they colonized us, they also colonized knowledge. They also colonize perspective. They also colonize the way we look at things. That happens with every conquest. But we began now, basically, I said, to create a fresh pair of eyes. And the first phrase that emerged in the context of foreign policy was, I'm sure all of you will recall, was Afro-Asia. Afro-Asia was the bedrock of the new momentum that we would provide to an alternate view of the world, or an alternative view of the world. And I often wonder where this phrase Afro-Asia has disappeared. And why did it disappear? Why did it suddenly disappear? To use a famous metaphor from another context, why did it disappear like camphor? The other context was actually just to put you in perspective, on the Third Battle of Panipat. I remember reading in the Maratha Chronicles that the battle raged intensely till the afternoon, and then the armies disappeared like camphor from the field. It is a very, very evocative phrase. But this phrase also disappeared like camphor. And why did it disappear? May I submit that the reason why it disappeared was that, while I cannot say for sure whether Africa means what we mean it to mean, but certainly Asia did not mean what we expected it to mean. The biggest and most important outcome of Afro-Asia's endeavors and Afro-Asia's perspectives was surely Bandung. And Bandung itself, although noble in spirit and wise in self-belief, did not survive very long. Between 1956 and 1962 is a matter of less than 7 years. And after that, of course, we have been struggling once again to find not only a different perspective, but also on a parallel course to find the meaning of Asia. Those of us, and we are all, I suppose, we are all certainly in that business of trying to find a rationale for behavior through the conduct of foreign policy, know that we have compartmentalized Asia already into a West Asia, and then from a West Asia into a Gulf, and then from a Gulf into a South Asia. And there are disputes and disputations about where South Asia begins and where it ends. From our point of view, we know what South Asia represents. It represents broadly the SAARC region. Then there is a Central Asia and there is an East Asia. And at the very best, even at its, even without being, as I said, disputatious, we acknowledge that all these geographies do not have the complementarity that we might, in an ideal world, want them to have or expect them to have. They have different self-interests. They have different and legitimately different self-interests. In fact, I could argue that because of not simply colonization, but because of our history, India has been in a sense closer geopolitically to Europe than it has been to China. Nobody really understands what an expanse the Himalayas mean and the plateau mean, and how the Himalayas actually have kept two very ancient peoples with extraordinary history and culture in both spaces. But the Himalayas have been a much bigger wall, actually, than anything between us and Europe. We did not even actually, India and China did not even actually find their way, although there was trade, and there was very powerful trade, did not really find their way towards each other even by sea. Although it is a good moment to add that India and China have been trading with each other for many more centuries than we can count. But the first naval battle on these waters, whether it was the Indian Ocean or the South China Sea, the first naval battles only started with the arrival of the Europeans. There is no record of a naval battle between India and China. So there were attitudes and there were realities that shaped the world, but we had not found each other, and sometimes monks and travelers did find their way to each other, and certainly Buddhism found a way towards the philosophies that shaped the Chinese mind, and there was huge interaction, not merely Chinese, but in the terms of our political interests, they were more separate. The interesting part is, for me, the reinvention of Asia in the 21st century. And Asia is actually reinventing itself into very powerful dynamics. And this has happened over the last 2 decades. Actually, you could precisely take it. It is maybe the process started within the 1980s and has moved forward with a greater momentum. And what is the Asia that we see now? While recognizing, as I said, that there are spaces which have their own self-interests and collaborations. What is the Asia that we see from Delhi? If you stand somewhere in Delhi, anywhere in Delhi, and look east, you find a very interesting conglomeration of nations and peoples. There are nations of any number of languages. There are nations, by the way, between India, and just in case you think that there is a religious component also to this, and there are more Muslims living between India and Indonesia than living between India and Sahel and North Africa. Literally. Between the populations of India, Bangladesh, Malaysia and Indonesia. So what I am going to suggest next has really nothing to do with religion per se. It's only one of the factors in this mix. There are languages, there are religions, there are many kinds of political systems. There's democracy, there is semi-democracy, there is monarchy-led democracy, there is party-led government, as in China, in Marxist government there, and there is Japan. I mean, every kind of model that you can find possibly in the world's mix is there. And yet, there is one common strand. There is one common strand which is hugely important between India and all the nations going up to Japan. Broadly, despite the exceptions, including the one that you mentioned of a certain missile traveling from east into the Pacific, broadly, without, despite, we can say that all the nations and all the people of this region are engaged in creating a better life and a better economy for themselves. And therefore, I call this Asia, from here to the east of us, basically the arc of prosperity, or the arc that is searching for prosperity. China is doing it. You can see the energies of China having concentrated in the last 2.5 decades purely on this. You can see the energies of India concentrating so heavily into this. You can see in Bangladesh, you can see everywhere. You can see in Indonesia, wherever you find. You find broadly, whichever government comes, whatever may be its origins, they are saying, how can we turn the 21st century into a century that is better for our people? And when we mean our people, we do not mean merely the elites. That means us, you and I. What we mean is the people who have left outside these rooms. And that, I think, is a remarkably positive objective that we share, and which is actually helping us to come together in ways that are sometimes not so obvious, but in ways which I shall enumerate. And if you look from Delhi to our west, you find a very different pattern. You find nations which are of whatever religion or ethnicity they might be. You find nations which have huge levels of resource prosperity or resource wealth and so on. But you also find that I can barely think, I will not be more specific, but I can barely think of 3 or 4 nations between us and right up to the north of Africa, where the governments are fully in control of all their territory. And there is a rampant militias in operation, there is terrorism, there is instability. And they are trying to work their way, the governments their way, and find answers to this rampaging instability and conflict. So already we can see, in real terms, 2 different Asias. But there is also great churn going on in Central Asia. A Central Asia which is just to the north of the region I just described, where nations and governments and societies are trying to create a region where religion can live at peace with itself and ensure that religion does not become a source of instability. In their particular case, let us be frank about it, that Islam is not misused to become a source of instability. And that is the Asia which is a very interesting Asia. It's a post-Soviet Asia. Then we have the even more fascinating reality of Russia in its post-Soviet dimension finding its place in the map of Asia. The recent conference at Vladivostok was only one signature event that you can see that Moscow's literally the most, I think Russia has 8 time zones or something like that. 8 or 9, 10. See, I stopped counting. Out of 10 time zones, 8, if not 9, would be in Asia. So you can imagine the vast hinterland that exists. And the arrival of Russia into the map of Asia is itself a very exciting phenomenon. Exciting and, from our perspective, an extremely welcome phenomenon. So these are the inventions or reinventions that are reshaping Asia, both in terms of the challenges we face as well as the opportunities that exist. And one of the most exciting options that is slowly gaining momentum, no international grouping ever acquires critical mass unless it has spun around quite a few times. And one of the most exciting really options now that SAARC has proved to be less exciting than it was at conception, is BRICS. And RIC is really at the heart of BRICS. And this, if there is closer cooperation and indeed economic collaboration between R, I and C, you will see these 3 nations really having a very profound and positive impact upon the future of this continent. Why is Asia becoming slowly, confident enough to believe that it will be in the vanguard of progress in the 21st century? And the most important evidence for this is because the powers of Asia have now realized that it is counterproductive to permit or to allow disputes to turn into differences and differences to become conflicts. And the most mature relationship within BRICS is the one between India and China. Once again, like every single geography in the world, there is no geography without history. Sometimes there is history without geography, but not the other way around. And history is really the burden of things we wish we hadn't done or hadn't happened. So there is a history in the Himalayas as well. We have 4,000 kilometers of a border with China. We have a history also that includes conflict. But over and over again, the two nations have found the maturity to say that yes, irrespective of what may happen in the short term, irrespective of what may happen in the medium term, irrespective of passions that may rise because of ground realities, the only way forward is resolution through dialogue. And if India and China can create that as a model for behavior, surely it is good news not only for us, but it is good news for the rest of the world. That this is the only way forward. I've just come back after 2 trips to Europe. It's only when you see the center of Europe and the Balkans and the Baltics and so on and so forth that you get a sense truly of how much progress Europe has made simply because it chose dialogue over conflict. And while the process of dialogue may have its ups and downs, nobody has found a substitute. And the reason why sensible nations choose dialogue is not because they are angelic or they have suddenly been blessed, with some part of the Holy Spirit and have become angels. It is purely because out of self-interest. In the end, who is hurt by conflict? The people of the conflict countries. Governments pay far less of a price than the people, because conflict becomes an obstruction to that economic growth which is essential for the welfare of the people. The elite have enough already. The challenge is how to get 400 more million Indians into the middle class. That is the challenge. I'm sure that challenge existed for China as well. It exists everywhere. So if we want a better life, and if that is the objective of all government, as indeed it should be, an objective which defined in the powerful words of our Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, in the very first speech that he gave to Parliament, which is now 3 years ago. And I could almost hear the hush when he began that paragraph or those 2 sentences, when he said that the age of poverty alleviation is over. And you can imagine that it would be a very loud hush indeed when a Prime Minister said this, until he came to the next sentence, which was, the era of poverty elimination has begun. Alleviation is no longer acceptable, because the pace of alleviation does not now match the aspirations of the people. They want elimination. They waited 70 years of freedom. And freedom for them has to include freedom from not only hunger, but freedom from uncertainty. You cannot have hundreds of millions of people who are uncertain. They may not be starving or hungry, they certainly are not. But we have to remove not only uncertainty, we have to create the certainties which give them a better life, which give their children the chance that they themselves have been denied. Those are the massive challenges which is really the true objective. If governance, again to quote the Prime Minister, is not about improving the lives of people, what is it about? And of course, you cannot have prosperity without peace. And the recognition, and Asia again is taking the leadership, the recognition that in a initiative, once again led by our Prime Minister, that if prosperity is not possible without peace, which indeed it is not, then who is the most powerful contemporary where is the most powerful contemporary challenge to peace coming from? It is coming from terrorism. And therefore, you have to fight terrorism without ifs, without buts, and this may be useful for our European friends to carry back home. There are no ifs and no buts in the conflict with this ism. You have suffered isms before. Terrorism is the most dangerous ism of the 21st century. And therefore, the BRICS resolution, once again I'm telling you the practical application. The BRICS resolution on terrorism eliminates now the ifs and buts. And BRICS recognizes that you must now say it, that the age of fudge is also over. And exactly around the same time, even America, which has invested so much American blood and treasure into the conflicts of Afghanistan, has sent a very clear message that there is no compromise possible with terror, and nations who are the equivalents of Vichy France have no place unless they change. Very clear message is being sent. And this message, I tell you, will resonate through this century. It will not change friendships. It will not change strategic relations, but hopefully it will change behavior patterns. Should not be imagine now that suddenly X will stop its friendship with Y. Why should it? But we can expect a change in behavior patterns so that we can all live and work towards a similar objective, as I said, which is the objective of prosperity, and which is the objective of prosperity not simply for the sake of itself, but for the sake of the people. And that is why, my friends, Asia, because not only is Asia reinventing itself, but Asia is reinventing itself through solutions, through recognition of reality, through accepting, just as Europe accepted, that there is no point going around blaming the rest of the world before we eliminate the problems we have created for ourselves with wondrous consequences. The European Union truly is a magnificent creation of human will. And those who, maybe it's not right to say, but those who don't recognize this are not recognizing a very important and a very powerful reality of the 20th century, which is the same reality which should sustain through this century if we are going to make this century a century of peace. So friends, I'm delighted that we are having a conference on Asia. These are the brief few thoughts I had in my mind, and I hope and I know that your thoughts will be far more, with far more depth, far more clarity, and far more use than my remarks. Thank you very much for this opportunity.